the Lord will recover for the second time with his hand. Now, there are some translations that don't indicate a second time, and if you've got one of those translations, you might want to check the Hebrew. And so God will with his own hand, recover for the second time his people. And where will they come from? From Assyria, Egypt, Patrush, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamad, from the islands of the sea. If you look at verse 12 at the concluding statement, it says, from the four corners of the earth. Well, a second time. How many times before that can you have? One. It's not rocket science. So when the Jewish people came back from Babylon, where did they come back from? Babylon, and nothing else. So that was not a fulfillment of this prophecy. This prophecy only started to become fulfilled for the first time in about 1880 up to today. Because that's the regathering of the Jewish people back to the land. And God in the book of Ezekiel explains this, that he will regather them, Ezekiel 20, 24, and later on in the book of Ezekiel, for two reasons, in wrath and for wrath. He will gather them together so that his glory may be seen through them. The purpose is to bring them back to himself and for himself. And he doesn't do this because Israel is such a righteous people. I wish. God will have to regather them a second time because at that point they will be saved, because they at that point will listen to them. But in the book of Ezekiel, in verse 22, Ezekiel 36, 22, it says, therefore say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord God, it is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I'm about to act, but for my holy name, which you have profaned amongst the nations. God is fulfilling the promises despite his people. He will do that because he loves his people and he will keep his promises. And so he will bring them back as a saved people in the millennial kingdom. Now, we're not in the millennial kingdom yet, so today they are gathered together in and for wrath. Now, the promise of the land, Chad, the promise of the land, there will be one land. In the book of Ezekiel, it gives you the boundaries, and the boundaries are from Lebo Hamad in the north to Kadesh in the south. Now, that's a bit of a problem, because if you would have read all of the promises of the land covenant, you would have seen that it was much bigger. The promise to Abraham in Genesis 15 includes the territory of the Hittites. Now, the Hittites at the time of Abraham were in Asia Minor, or what we call today Turkey. Not only that, in Isaiah 19, verse 18, it says that there will be 5 cities in Egypt that will be speaking Hebrew. They'll be speaking the language of Canaan. So, how is God going to deal with this? Well, I don't know. It may be that the top part, where the Hittites were at the time, will be given just to one of the 2 princes, maybe to Abraham and Isaac, while the bottom part, below Kadesh, will be given over to Jacob. I don't know. But this would be the fullest extent of the land grant that God made to Abraham. Now, sometimes you see other maps, and they'll include much more of the Euphrates all the way towards what is here on the map called Elam, here in the south. That's a little bit of an overstatement. God has promised also land to other peoples. And so, for instance, in the book of Joshua, we know that he has promised the land, and Joshua declares that they cannot take the land of Edom and Moab because that was given over to the children of Lot. And so there is land that is not included in that. So this is a fairly accurate map based on the descriptions. Now, if God says, well, no, the Hittite had already moved down, it's those Hittites that I mean, so be it. I can live with that, because he is king, and it's not me. Now, within the land, there will be a specific area which is called Jerusalem. Does that, yeah, you see, it now becomes a little bit squashed. And Jerusalem, based on the book of Ezekiel, is described as not only a high mountain, but it is city that cannot even fit currently upon the mount. Even the house of the Lord could not fit on Temple Mount. So based on today's description, both geography and in terms of the city, in terms of the temple, none of that would fit. What you see here is that there will be a new city on a new mountain. And that city will not be called Jerusalem, it will be called Yahweh Shammah. The Lord, it is there. It is the last verse in the book of Ezekiel. Now, as you can see, it is a significant area, but it is also relatively small. Now, you and I will go to Jerusalem and we will want to worship the Lord. My advice is make sure you have your walking shoes with you, because from the city it's about 4.5 to 6 kilometers to the temple. So we might want to leave early to make sure we get there on time. Jerusalem will be the chief of the mountains. That means the highest mountain. Well, today it isn't. This is the Lord's doing. This is the Lord's mountain. And Jerusalem will be the city that is redeemed. Now, it's not that it's the name of the city necessarily, but all of those who are in it are the redeemed people. So within Jerusalem, there will not be unredeemed people. God's personal glory will dwell on it. Chapter 4 is not a very extensive chapter, but it says this in Isaiah 4, 3-6. And it will come about that he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, whose name or whose life is recorded in Jerusalem, when the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and purged the bloodshed from Jerusalem, from amongst her midst, by the spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning. In other words, there will be a purification for her at some stage. Then the Lord will create over the whole area of the Mount of Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day, even smoke, and the brightness of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory will be a canopy. This cloud is the glory cloud. Christians often use the term Shekinah. It comes from the rabbinic Hebrew, meaning the glory cloud, kavod in the biblical Hebrew language. Shekinah means the localized presence of God. So like with the tabernacle, so here too, God's visible presence will be there, manifesting in that glory cloud. As I mentioned, no, I didn't mention it yet. The throne of God himself will be there. Now, to some degree, you can see that in Psalm 2 and in Jeremiah chapter 3. Verse 17. At that time, they shall call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord, and all the nations will be gathered to it. For the name of the Lord, let me try that again. At that time, they shall call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord, and all the nations will be gathered to it, to Jerusalem, for the name of the Lord, nor shall they walk after their own stubbornness or their evil heart. It is at this point that the throne of God will be established there. The throne of God in the Old Testament was seen in the tabernacle. Inside the tabernacle there was the Ark of the Covenant with the 2 cherubim on top. God's visible presence was in that he was enthroned between the cherubim. So here too, that's what we see. Now the Ark of the Covenant will not be there at that time, but God's throne will be. There's the naming of the gates and of the city in the book of Ezekiel. And again, the book of Zechariah does the same, what we saw earlier. God is doing this not because of who they are. God is doing this because of who he is. We have to remind ourselves consistently with this. Book of Zechariah, chapter 1. Because God is exceedingly zealous for Jerusalem and for Zion. The word zealous in the Hebrew, it's the same as, it's the word kana, zealous or jealous is the same word. When it's used of God, it's never in a negative. So while we might have the word jealous, it's not because he is jealous of something, it's more that he is zealous. And so it is a righteous jealousness in that sense. And he repeats this consistently, that he is zealous for her and for his land, for his people. And so he's doing this because of who he is. Now within the Jerusalem, you will see in Ezekiel chapter 47, the two rivers that will come out of the Temple Mount. Now this river, at the moment in Jerusalem, there is no river. This river will be a life-giving river. The river will split into two, coming out of Jerusalem, going east and west. And most rivers only go one way, but this will go two ways. And what it will do, it will bring life to the Dead Sea. On the next slide, you will see some references. And so Ezekiel chapter 41, the prophet is brought back to the door of the house, and behold, water was flowing from under the threshold of the house, going east and going west. This is the purification waters that God will bring himself from here. Now, Jerusalem has no river. It is a dry place in itself. There are springs underneath, including Temple Mount. But God is bringing life to the city. And when he does so, he will make, therefore, as it says in Psalm 46, glad the streams of God, and make glad the city of God. It is because of what he is doing. But it's not just a river that is flowing there. We will too go there. We will flow to Jerusalem. And what is the purpose for us going to Jerusalem? To worship. Now, many people, when they come to the worship aspect, will find it problematic because aren't there Jewish priests? Well, there will be Jewish priests and Gentile priests. Jewish priests will not be in the order of Levi. They will too be the same order. Christ will be then our high priest, and he's in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Levi. So our worship will be distinct from and different from the old. But there will be Jewish priests who come from that line, just as there will be Gentile priests. Now Phinehas, and you'll all remember the story, it's my favorite story in the book of Numbers. Remember the story? He got a covenant of peace from God. Why? Because he killed two people. Why did he kill them? Because they were making an abomination right inside Israel. Therefore, behold, I will give him my covenant of peace, and it shall be for him that his descendants after him a covenant of perpetual priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for Israel. So the descendants of Phinehas, not all Levites, not all priests of the old order will automatically come in. Only some. The same in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 44. Only those of the line of Zadok will come in. Why? Because he stood with David. Therefore he is distinct. But it's not just for Jewish priests, there will also be Gentile priests. Now in the Old Testament period, no Gentile could come in. If this was the sanctuary, you could come as far as the court of the Gentiles and not further. Then there would be a barrier, and on the barrier it said, if you go past this barrier and you're caught, you will die. You may be executed. And the Romans took away execution rights from the Jewish people with one exception, and that is the one exception. If any Gentile, including a Roman soldier, was caught inside that barrier, he was allowed to be executed by the Jewish people. That's how seriously they took this. Now in the book of Isaiah, chapter 56, it says this. 56, it should say verse 4, including verse 4. For thus says the Lord, to the eunuch who keeps my Sabbath and who chooses what pleases me, who holds fast to my covenant, to them I will give in my house and within my name a memorial and a name that is better than sons and daughters. And I will give him an everlasting name which shall not be cut off. They are called the servants of God in verse 6, and they will keep fast to the covenant and to the Sabbath. Now today we are not under Mosaic law, so we don't have to keep the Sabbath. And it seems that the Sabbath will come back at that stage. But today we have that freedom. But not only is this man here described as a Gentile, he's described as a eunuch. In other words, one who's been castrated. On both accounts, he should be excluded from the priesthood. And God says, in the millennial kingdom, that is no barrier. What is it that you need to do? Hold fast to what God is doing at that time. That's the point that he's making. Now, it doesn't mean that you can all be uncircumcised in the kingdom, because that's not the case. Now, there will be 2 circumcisions required, and we see that in the book of Ezekiel. And I do have a long knife with me. Ezekiel 44, thus says the Lord God, let no foreigner uncircumcised in heart and uncircumcised in flesh, of all the foreigners who are amongst the sons of Israel, shall they come into my sanctuary. This needs to happen first. It is the cutting of those bits that set us apart to God. So that is still a requirement. There are still elements that come across, but it is not the same. As I said before, within this we see 4, if we do a larger study, 4 temples and 1 tabernacle. Moses set up the tabernacle, Solomon the first temple, Zerubbabel, or we call it often Herod's temple, second temple. The Antichrist will take over the next temple that is to come, and we looked at that a little bit yesterday. But the Messiah will reign, and he will have a temple in Jerusalem, and that's the 4th Jewish temple. That aspect is described primarily in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 40 to 48. It goes beyond us to read all of that, but it would be a well worth study. And the temple that he will build is not possible to be on Temple Mount currently. It is so large. So today, when the Jewish people are thinking they are building the next temple, they're not building this temple. They're building a temple for the Antichrist, sadly. And they don't know this at this point, but they're hoping to build this. But looking at the descriptions in terms of size, it just does not fit. And so it is impossible to build it. If we look at the altar in the center of it, is that up? Great. 6 meters, nearly 6 meters high, including the horns. And the horn is a symbol of strength, and particularly the strength of salvation. And that's what we receive at that point. It'll be nearly 10 by 10 meters square, and it will have stairs but not a ramp. So it is distinct from the past. Now in the past they had to build a ramp because of the garments that they were wearing. It would show something more than just the ankles. It might show the knees, and that would be immodesty. It would be immoral. And so God says in the future that will not be an issue. Now that comes us to the next point, because once you have built an altar, what do you need? Sacrifices. Well, that's problematic, isn't it? Because Christ is our once for all sacrifice. And it doesn't just repeat that phrase, once for all, once in the book of Hebrews. It says it about 4 or 5 times. So how does that work? Well, the sacrifices are not just described in the book of Ezekiel, and the book of Hebrews clearly says once for all. Now earlier we did a communion. What did we mean by that? When we took that bread and that wine, what did we do? We looked back and we said, Christ died for us. And we looked back at that sacrifice. In the millennial kingdom, we too will look back at. But because sin will be greatly reduced during that time, they too will have a visible reminder of this. And what is that visible reminder? A physical sacrifice. Now, the sacrifice doesn't necessarily deal with sin in the way we think of it. It does mention the word atonement, the word kippur, but within the context of it, it also indicates that this is for purification. And so, much like our communion service, 1 Corinthians 11, it is looking back. The Old Testament sacrifices looking forwards to the cross, millennial sacrifices looking back at the cross. And every single time it mentions the word kippur, it indicates ritual purification. During that time, both the priest and the nations need to receive purifications. So it's not so much for atonement, I think. The word is mentioned in the translation, and in the Hebrew it says kippur, and it is something that we'll need to think about. I think the best thing to do is to leave it at ritual purification and ask God, when we are there in the kingdom, to clarify it. Because this is just one of those things that is difficult to do. But that's for the priest. What about us? What will we do? Well, we too will be worshiping there. How do we worship there? By celebrating the feast. Now, the first feast that is mentioned in the book of Ezekiel 45:21 is the Passover. When we look at it, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, you shall have the Passover, a feast of 7 days. Unleavened bread shall be eaten. Immediately he combines not just one, but two of the feast, Passover and unleavened bread, as though they are one feast. And so it seems to be that there is more than just one. Then he continues in verse 17. He says the feast and appointed festivals. Now, the word appointed festivals can mean appointments that God has made with us in time, and that's what we see here probably. In chapter 46, he also mentions Sabbaths and new moons. Now, the one that is distinct is in the book of Zechariah, chapter 14, where he mentions the Feast of Tabernacles. And that's quite interesting, because the Feast of Tabernacles is the last feast. Passover is the first feast, and if we look at Leviticus 23, we can see a sequence of 7 feasts. So here the first and the last feast are mentioned. Does it mean that all of them will be celebrated? I don't know. Will they be celebrated the same way that Moses did? The answer is no. Because atonement cannot be made at that point, because the blood of bulls and goats does not take away sin. That does not change. Not only that, the Ark of the Covenant is not in the new temple that will be there at that time. Jeremiah 3:16 talks about that. So in that sense, it will be distinct. Now, might there be a memorial for it? Possible. But will it be the same as then? The answer is no. Now, will all the people go up to Jerusalem? No, but they will all need to send a delegation. And so the book of Zechariah, in particular chapter 14, talks about that if Egypt doesn't go up to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, why is Egypt accepted here or specially mentioned? Well, when the Jewish people came out of Egypt in the Exodus, God says, as a reminder for that event, I want you to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, because you tabernacled in the wilderness and I tabernacled among you. When you left Egypt, well, Egyptians might not want to be reminded of that event. And God says, if they don't come up, they will have no rain. Now, I was born in the Netherlands, and we have 200, 300 days of the year with rain. And I would be quite happy for no rain for a year. It's nice not to walk in the rain, not to go to school or work in the rain. But over here, we understand what that means. Because when there is no rain, there is no crop. Things burn down, as they did this year dramatically in New South Wales and in Queensland. It's a bad thing. Not only that, when we look at the details in terms of what is being offered, it is different. Now, it goes beyond my purpose to explain all of this, because there's a few slides here in a row where you will see that there is a distinction between the law of Moses and the book of Ezekiel. And based on those differences, the rabbis actually didn't want the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, because they said the law of Moses is an eternal law. Now, that's not the case. We will always have a law, not the law of Moses. Adam had a law. Noah had a law. Moses had a law. We have a law. They will have a law. But it's not the same law. And so here, one of those differences can be seen in the festivals. Here's another slide with some of those differences for the Feast of Tabernacles. The other thing that is distinct is for the Sabbaths. For the new moons. I don't want to say the devil is in the details, because that's the wrong expression. But God is in the details, and He says this is not the same as that. If it was an eternal law, it would be exactly the same. And the same people could come up and worship Him. But that's not the case. We already saw the Gentile priest would be allowed. Not only Gentile priest, but eunuchs. Not only that, the offerings will be different. There are real differences between Ezekiel and Moses. And so we're not going back under Levitical law, we will be under kingdom law. There's a real difference. Now, I mentioned briefly already that God's glory will be there. God's glory is very significant because it actually indicates His presence. Now behold, in chapter 43, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the way of the east. Now, earlier in the book of Ezekiel, in chapter 20, the glory of God leaves. But now, he sees the glory coming back. Not only does it come back, but the glory fills the whole house. Now, within the millennial kingdom, the eastern gate will be permanently shut as a symbol that God's glory will not leave again. God's glory will be permanently there during the millennial kingdom. God is permanently there. And so in chapter 44, verses 1 and 2, it indicates that the gate that is facing towards the east is shut. It will not open. And so God's glory will never leave again at that point. Now, there is one more aspect, and that's the reversal of the curse. Because at this point we're only in the millennial kingdom, only a part of the curse is reversed. When we are in eternity, which is past the millennial kingdom, at that point the reversal is permanent. But during the millennial kingdom, much of the curse will be reversed. Now, the curse was pronounced in Genesis 3:15, and to some degree we are still suffering under that. When you and I go to work, what do? We sweat. That wasn't a part of the original. Things became hard and difficult. Childbirth became difficult. Relationships became difficult. The ground was cursed. A whole lot of things will be changed in the millennial kingdom. In the millennial kingdom, there will be a significant change, but not a total reversal. Why? Because Satan will be locked up for 1,000 years. At the end of the 1,000 years, he'll be released, but at this point, he will no longer be able to influence people. Now, people will still have a sinful nature, and those that are born in the kingdom still have a sinful nature. They will still need to commit themselves to the Lord to be saved. They're saved the same way as you and I, by faith through grace. Isaiah 24, verses 21. So it will happen on that day that the Lord will punish the host of heaven on high and the kings of the earth. They'll be gathered together like prisoners in a dungeon, and they will be confined in prison. And after many days they shall be punished. Here we see that what John later on then declares the 1,000 years for, that the host of heaven, that's a reference to the angelic realm. They will be confined. And who with them? The kings of the earth who were coming with them. They will be locked up. Now, when they are locked up, what will abound with us? Holiness, righteousness. And so in Isaiah 52, awake, awake, clothe yourself in your strength, O Zion, clothe yourself in the garments of beautiful. O Jerusalem, the holy city. In other words, there will be holiness and righteousness within Jerusalem in particular, but over all the earth there will be an increase in this. In Isaiah 60 verse 21, then all your people will be righteous and they'll possess the land. There is a change in that sense. There'll be peace with the animal kingdom. Isaiah chapter 11. And the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the young lion together with the fatling, and a little boy will lead them. Well, would you put you probably don't have little children, but I do. Would you put them with these animals together? No, the answer is no, you wouldn't do that. See, but at that point they will. Verse 8, the nursing child will play by the hole of a cobra, and the weaned child will put his hand on a viper's den. And again, if you had babies, would you do that? Would you allow them to play there? And the answer is no. So there will be a new relationship with the animal kingdom. There'll be an increase in fertility when we looked at Amos 9, because at that point the plower will overtake the reaper. And in the book of Ezekiel, when that river is established, that dual river going east and west, what do we see? That even the Dead Sea, and so if you come with me next year to Israel, we'll swim there, you will see that there is no life in it. It will be then a place where they can go and fish. That's significant. Now, after Satan's release at the end of the millennial kingdom, there will be that final rebellion, and Psalm 2 talks about that, Psalm 110 indicates this. It is only after that that God will judge them, and they are permanently confined. Then death, the last enemy, will be destroyed. It is at that point that we can truly say the kingdom of our Lord has come. So the millennial kingdom will not be eternal. It is only temporarily. It's only for 1,000 years. But I hope by this you've been able to see that the kingdom is so much bigger than that one reference in Revelation 2-5. It's not just about 1,000 years. It is based on God's promises, both the covenants and the promises that He's made. It is bigger because God has made promises to both Jews and Gentiles that we will partner with Him in the kingdom, that His kingdom will be over all the earth. And at that point there will be righteousness and truth, not just there, but in and through all of us. Well, there you go. That's all I had to say about that. Questions? Did you have a